My Darling Abyss by Stewart J. Clarke. Chapter 1. 4. Abyss had killed Daniel 3 times. This was the 4th. She reached the top of the stairs and stood in the doorway. He looked up from his work, squinting at her through the shadows. "How the hell did you get out?" he said. Abyss stepped into the lab and lowered her hood. The harsh white lights hit her face. Daniel's pallid features went from annoyance to surprise and then to excitement. "You're not mine," he said. She took another step closer. "It's uncanny." His eyes moved over her slowly, as if she were a bug under a microscope. "You've got the same dark eyes and skin, same hair, or lack of, same nasty frown. You look older, though. What are you, 13, 14? Mine's only 10, but she's still a pain in the arse." Another step. Daniel rubbed his hands. "So, did I do it? Was it me, my alt self? Did I get you here?" He laughed, revealing his red-stained teeth. "She worked. She actually worked. I was starting to give up hope, starting to think it was all a failure." He motioned to the piles of tools, stacks of diagrams and equations, empty bottles, and finally to the device before him, which was little more than a tangle of wires and warped plastic panels. "I thought all my efforts were for nothing, and that you lot would never get the chance to test her. But no, you're here now. You're living proof that she's legit." One last step. Close enough. "So I take it you have a message for me? From me? Come on, I know you're not shy. Don't they talk where you're from? I suppose it's possible. Anything's possible, isn't it?" He jabbed a finger towards her. "Okay, then show me. Mary, or whatever the hell your version is. She's in the bag, isn't she?" Abyss slipped a guitar bag from her shoulder and reached for the zip. Daniel nodded, and his mouth opened into another red grin. "Yes, show me. Show me how she works. Show me where I've been going wrong all this time." She reached into the bag, but instead of Mary, she drew out a Beretta, which she aimed at his forehead. His grin melted away. Abyss! The shot crashed around the mansion. The top of Daniel's skull shattered. He continued to look at her, his cold eyes now devoid of life. Then he toppled backward and hit the tiles with a wet thud. The echoes sounded for several more moments. Once they faded, Abyss approached Daniel slowly, the gun trained on him, her finger poised on the trigger, ready to squeeze a second time if he so much as blinked. But he didn't. He lay motionless, staring up at the ceiling, blood spreading around his head like a dark halo.
She swallowed hard and turned away, making for the nearest window, and rested her head on the cool glass. Her heart pounded, and she tasted hot, sour bile. She sucked in several large breaths and willed herself not to puke. Will it always feel like this? She dismissed the thought. It didn't matter. There was a job to do. She wiped the sweat from her face using her sleeve and made for the door, pausing at the top of the stairs to listen for any sounds of approaching footsteps. Nothing. Sentry Hall was quiet, save for the familiar creaks of the floorboards and groans from old plumbing. By some miracle, Nanny didn't exist here, just like in the previous 3, but even so, she kept a tight grip on the gun as she descended the stairs, her footfalls barely making a sound. The air cooled rapidly as she dropped below ground level, and her breath formed a mist in front of her. At the bottom of the stairs, she reached a long corridor of damp concrete and flaking plaster, with doors down each side. The bowels of the mansion. Once a servants' quarters, now a prison block, and it was occupied. Sounds of movement drifted from behind the doors. The gunshot had awoken the guinea pigs. Abyss snatched the keys from their usual place, a hook by the door in the gloomy pantry, and unlocked each door in turn. When she reached the stairs, she tossed the keys over her shoulder and hurried back up, before any of them could poke their heads out and catch a glimpse of her. Back in the lab, she grabbed all the wooden stools and made a stack of them in the middle of the room, then stuffed in sheets of paper, cardboard boxes and any other flammables she could find. Finally, she picked up Daniel's failed attempt at Mary and carefully placed it on the top. His life's work was now nothing more than a discarded heap, much like the man himself. She waited, listening to the footsteps and the low, excited murmurs in the rooms below, and when the front door slammed, she crossed to the window, wiped off a film of grime, and watched the 6 small figures run down the gravel drive, out through the gate, and into the night. She sighed. It was almost done. She pushed open all the windows, flooding the room with chilled, salty air, and then after a final check that everything was in place, she struck a match and dropped it onto the pile. The flames spread through it quickly, rising high and blackening the ceiling. The breeze from the open windows sent glowing embers floating into the air and then down across the tiles, wall panels, and Daniel's corpse. Abyss blacked slowly towards the stairs, watching the flames melt Mary and purge the lab in a roaring, crackling, comforting blaze. It was only when the heat threatened to singe off her eyebrows and blister her flesh did she turn and run towards the exit. It was a cool night. The moon shone brightly. She strode down the driveway, following in the footprints of the children. The first explosion hit, blowing out all the glass on the middle floor. She quickened her pace, out of the gate and onto Beacon Hill. Below, the village of Pikemouth Bay shone in the moonlight. Most of the cottages and shops were in darkness. There were no sounds of sirens yet, and with luck, by the time they arrived, Century Hall would be beyond saving. She turned back in time to see a second explosion tear through the roof, throwing slates into the air as if they were autumn leaves in a gale. This was followed by a loud crash which shook the hillside beneath her feet. Black smoke and dust billowed out of the ground floor windows, and Abyss knew the inner floors had collapsed. The outer shell might survive, but everything within was now either burned, broken, or buried. Job finished. Here, at least. She drew Mary from her bag, flipped open a panel on the side and keyed in a string of coordinates, then aimed it. After taking a final glance around to ensure there were no witnesses, she squeezed the trigger. It whirred to life, shaking and warming her hands. A purple beam shot from the barrel, flew out 10 feet in front and ripped a hole in mid-air. Through this, she could see sunlight and smell a damp summer meadow. Abyss dropped Mary in her bag, slowly approached the tear, and stepped through.
Chapter 2 8 Abyss had killed Daniel 7 times. This was the 8th. She reached the top of the stairs and stood in the doorway. He looked up from his work, straightened his glasses and peered at her in the dark. He was the oldest one yet. His hair was completely grey, and his skin wrinkled like the seat of an old leather sofa. A completed version of Mary lay on the workbench nearby, its side panel wide open and its innards exposed. In his gnarled hands was a squat spherical object, like a large battery. Abyss realised it was Mary's power cell, which he was in the process of modifying. Just the sight of it made her stomach churn. "How the hell did you get out?" he slurred. She walked into the light and lowered her hood. "Oh, hey!" He dropped the cell on the workbench with a dull thump that made her wince. "You're not mine. You're just a kid. Where the hell did you come from?" She said nothing. Hello? Are you receiving me? Over. Did you stumble here at random, or have you come bearing gifts?" She remained where she was, not needing or wanting to get any closer. Her aim was much better these days. "Well, this is a first, I must say. You'd think that with all the labs in all the worlds, and all the Marys, and all our alt cells, this place would be like King's Cross at rush hour." He grabbed a wine glass from the desk, and slurped the liquid down in a single gulp, then burped. "But then, when you consider all the possibilities, I suppose the odds of any crossovers would be trillions. No, More like centillions to one. Plus, the worlds where we exist are just a tiny percentage of the whole. Not that you could put a percentage on infinity, of course. He poured another glass, spilling most of it on the floor. As he gulped it down, Abyss took the opportunity to reach under her hoodie and slide the Beretta from her new shoulder holster. Have you run away? Is that it? Are you just as difficult and stubborn as mine? Of course you are. He sighed, reached for the bottle again, found it empty, and slammed it back. You do understand me, don't you? They do speak English where you're from, right? I suppose it's possible they don't. Anything is possible, isn't... He saw the weapon and froze. The glass slipped from his grip and shattered on the tiles. Is this some kind of joke? She levelled the gun at his face, her finger hooked on the trigger. Hey, whoa. I know you probably hate me, and I'm not exactly a life member of your fan club, but we both know you're not going to shoot me. I'm the one who... The bullet shattered Daniel's glasses and burst his left eyeball before piercing his brain. He spun around and dropped face first on the floor. Blood pooled beneath him, mixing with the spilled wine to create a thick maroon cocktail. Abyss closed her eyes and took 3 deep breaths. She could smell the thick odour of sulphur in tinged flesh. Her heart pounded and her hands were slick with sweat. But she didn't feel so nauseous this time. She made for the servants' quarters, her gun at the ready, still half expecting Nanny's pitbull face to appear around one of the corners. But no. It seemed too good to be true that after 8 jobs, she was yet to show up. Once the doors were unlocked, Abyss returned to the lab and prepared the fire, placing Mary in the usual position at the top. When the front door slammed, she crossed to the window and watched the almost grown-up guinea pigs run down the drive and out of the gate, towards the shimmering lights of Pikemouth. The fire consumed the lab with its usual ferocity, and Abyss left, pausing halfway towards the gate to gouge out a small hole in the grass and bury the power cell. Then, as the first explosion ripped through Century Hall, she used Mary to open the gateway and step through.
Chapter 3, 12. Abyss had killed Daniel 11 times. This was the 12th. Her gun was already drawn when she reached the top of the stairs. The lab looked new. It was rich with the smell of fresh paint and oil. Paperwork was stacked neatly. Gleaming tools hung in a rack along the left-hand wall, and there was only a single wine bottle which was almost full. Mary, barely even begun, rested on the workbench's polished surface. Daniel had his back to her. He was stood by the window, staring down towards the village, jigging up and down at the knees and muttering to himself, no doubt working on some theory or equation. He would never solve it. He died before he was aware there was any danger. The bullet cut through him and the window pane, turning the glass into an ugly spiderweb of cracks. Abyss turned at once and descended the stairs, slipping the hot Beretta back into the holster as she went. She had just entered the main lobby when her stomach cramped and emitted a gurgle like a newborn baby. She swore loudly and tried, and failed, to remember when she had last eaten a proper meal. She turned off into the main kitchen and pulled open the fridge, took out a carton of milk, gave it a cursory sniff before gulping it down. She made herself 2 ham sandwiches, one of which she wrapped in foil and dropped in her bag. The other she crammed into her mouth, chewing, swallowing, but not tasting. Before leaving, she grabbed a round silver tray from the sideboard, took aim and hurled it across the room like a frisbee. It struck a mahogany display cabinet, and a row of plates on the centre shelf all toppled forward in unison and hit the stone tiles with a satisfying crash. She left the kitchen and went into the library and snatched a couple of dusty paperbacks off the shelf and bagged them. Below, the servants' quarters were empty. The doors stood ajar. There were no beds or buckets in any of the rooms. made sense. This Daniel had been nowhere near the testing phase. Abyss shrugged her shoulders and returned upstairs. Back in the lab, she headed straight for the workbench and opened the third drawer down, where she knew there was a good chance of finding a bottle of lighter fluid. It was there, beneath a dog-eared copy of Hawkins' A Brief History of Time. She tipped half the bottle over the warm corpse, then drizzled the rest across the tables. Once outside, she ambled down the drive. An explosion lit the night, warmed her back, and cast her long dark shadow across the hillside. She yawned and kicked a pile of gravel into the air. Before activating Mary, she checked the pistol was safe in the holster. Ready for the next one.